Namaste, good evening, friends. Very warm welcome to all of you, and a very warm welcome to Sir. Ready? Oh, he's sitting there. I was trying to locate you. Well, many of you know, he's a very distinguished scholar, musician, and I was truly delighted to go through your CV. So, very warm welcome to you, sir. For this program, I must also thank Fair Observer and dear friend Atul Singh. You go a long way in life for joining hands with us. This is brought to you as part of Azadi Government, also India's 75 years of independence, where we are celebrating each and every aspect of our nation building and our civilizational wealth and our history, science, diplomacy, art, culture, Buddhism, thought, philosophy, and a lot more. But there's a larger reason why we are here today. At least that is what I perceive. And forget me if I'm wrong. Forgive me, sorry. My understanding is that even though Buddhism is well understood in this country, the Indian roots of Buddhism is not so well understood in the United States. And we have this responsibility of bringing the aspects of Buddhism from India here as to how it evolved, how it grew, what was the context in which Buddha lived, so on and so forth. And then there is this relevance of his time, Buddha's time, and our times today. 6th century BC was a time of extensive organization, a lot of wealth was being created, society had to answer new questions, and therefore Buddha's followers grew, and Buddhism gained prominence because it answered so many questions that the society is looking for. Fast forward 21st century, 2023, Indian conflict. We are living in a digital world, knowledge-led world. There's so much happening in the world around. Globalization, inequality, the stress and strain of social media. Everybody is looking for an anchor. In one way or the other, be it geopolitics of the world or geoeconomics of the world. Perhaps some of the anchors could be found in Buddhism. Who knows? Yesterday we had a function here to mark 132nd birth anniversary of B.R. Ambedkar, India's first Prime Minister in the architect of our Constitution. He looked for an answer, an anchor in Buddhism. For many of his hot ideas and debates that society, perhaps we could look into Buddhism as to how we can anchor ourselves in modern life in 21st century. But on that and many more aspects, over to Srinivas Reddy, and from here, I don't know, over to you, Vipul. Thank you very much. Please enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I would now like to invite Ms. Priya Acharya, who is an intern at Fair Observer. The Fair Observer is basically behind all this effort. They have organized Mr. Atul Singh and Fair Observer. They have put this event together. So I would like to invite Ms. Priya Acharya to take the proceeding forward.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Life is full of suffering. We all experience disappointment, sadness, and pain. With us today is someone we can help. Joining us from Brown University this evening is Srinivas Reddy, an eminent scholar, an accomplished translator, and a distinguished musician. Please join me in welcoming our enlightened speaker, Professor Srinivas Reddy.
Wow, thank you very much. I think that was the nicest introduction I've ever gotten in my life. So thank you, Priya. Thank you, Consul Sir, for being here. Vipul, and of course, Atul for organizing this. And to all of you for spending a Saturday night to learn about Buddhism and have a good discussion. We have a very nice, intimate, small group. I like to keep the discussion as active as possible. So I'll try to quickly go through some basic points that I wanted to share. And then hopefully we can have a good amount of Q&A before dinner. Does that sound good? Okay. So let us see. Okay, we're here. Very good. Thank you, George. Actually, no, but before we start, since Priya mentioned this, I used to do this in all of my classes now, and that is to have Dominate Shanti. So 2 minutes of peace. Gandhiji used to do this at his prayer meetings, and it's an excellent exercise that I've found brings us all together and allows us to have just 2 minutes of silence where we can just reflect on, I am here, we're at this thing together, we're going to spend some time together as a group, and let it be a good experience. So on that note, let us have, it's like totally like in India, there's always like some sounds, the air conditioner, the fans. So, but that's fine. Everything is good. Whatever happens, happens. The other big thing in meditation is we think thoughts are bad, but thoughts are not bad. Thoughts are beautiful things that allow all of this to happen. So thoughts are good in all of the meditation traditions. Thoughts are good, so just be with your thoughts. And again, an opportunity to just take 2 minutes out. So thank you all. We'll have 2 minutes of silence, and then we can get started. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so today, I hope everyone can see the writing at the bottom. If you don't see it on a couple of the slides, it's not a big deal. I just keep a couple key words there and I try to improvise around them. And like I was saying, I just hope to kind of get through some of these bigger points and then open up for discussions. I think that's the best way to learn and engage. So as Consul mentioned, Buddhism is very popular today. A lot of people, either know about Buddhism or even practice Buddhism or converted to Buddhism. But many people actually don't realize that Buddhism is Indian. It began in India. Buddha was an Indian guy, or a Nepali guy, or a South Asian guy. Buddha technically was born in what is now Nepal. But this theme, I think, is really important for us to think about, not only in the context of India, but the context of Buddhism as a world religion, and a very quickly spreading religion in the world. Just mentioning this to show that, growing up, I didn't realize that Buddhism was a thing. In fact, I don't even know if I really knew that Hinduism was a thing. because you just grow up with certain kind of practices and you just do what your parents do, and et cetera, et cetera. And we'll come to some of these distinctions, particularly what do these isms really mean, or what they don't mean, or what they have come to mean that we need to investigate further. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So the main big point, so what's written down there, it says Dharmic traditions, Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist. And this is a really important point to make clear. Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainisms, any ism is fundamentally a Western concept. In the sense, these aren't Western things, but they reflect the Western gaze upon traditions of another place. So in order to define what X people were doing, they had to say they follow Buddhism, or they follow Jainism, or they follow Hinduism. And it's very hard to define these religions in any clear-cut way, particularly what we today call Hinduism. There's no particular founder, there's no particular text, there's no do's or don'ts. You're kind of just born into it, and people do any number of things as Hindus. What makes Buddhism and Jainism different, and this is really important, and we can discuss it in further detail, but all Hindu schools of thought, as diverse as they are, fundamentally go back to the validity of the Vedas. These are revealed texts, Apaurushaya. They were not created by people, the rishis just heard them. They are Shruti, they're just heard. So it's like revealed knowledge, what we would call it. So the Vedas are these revealed hymns. And all schools of Hinduism validate the Vedas as a valid and important, and in fact, the ultimate source of knowledge. Buddhism and Jainism fundamentally differ from Hinduism in that they do not accept the validity of the Vedas. So there's a difference between them. And Buddhism and Jainism particularly, again, what makes them different is they had a founder. So Buddhism founded by Buddha, Jainism founded by Mahavira, both living around the same time, around 500 BC time. In fact, Buddha and Mahavira probably overlapped a little bit. Mahavira is a little bit older. But they were historically grounded in a figure, a known historical figure, that's one thing. Second, they rejected the validity of the Vedas. And third, they put a massive amount of emphasis on personal insight. Because that's what Buddha and Mahavira did. They went out and they sat by themselves, and they sat, and they sat, and they sat, and they had insight. And that insight was derived from some kind of inner reflection. So the knowledge that Buddha and Mahavira got came from within. It didn't come from outside, from the Vedas. So this is some important differences that we could say between Buddhism and Jainism on one side and Hinduism on the other side. However, all of these traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, really fall under one large category of religions, what we call Dharmic religions, because they're all related to Dharma. Now, Dharma is a very complex word. Dharma, Dharayati iti Dharma. So, Dharma is that which sustains something. It's like sustains the world. It's like the way. It's like the nature. It's the law. Some people. It's righteousness. It's duty. It's all of these things. But the key point is that Dharma falls in some level of interpretation in all of these traditions. Karma, another very important word, action, falls in all of these. Atma, whether the presence of, like in Hinduism, or the absence of in Buddhism, are important of all of these traditions. So karma, atma, dharma, all of these terms are fundamental to all of these traditions. And if I could really say what binds all of these together is that wheel. Fundamental to Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism is the idea of samsara, or cyclical existence. This is a fundamentally important point. all of these traditions, no matter what they believe or what they practice, believe that life goes on in a circular fashion, that people are reborn over and over again in kind of an unending cycle of existence. This, by the way, is what fundamentally makes all of these religions different than, let us say, the Abrahamic religions, which do not have a cyclical form of existence. So the epistemology there is going to be very different. Like, the whole worldview is going to be different. How we understand things is going to be quite different. So my point here is to say that Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, these dharmic traditions, as different as they are actually very fundamentally related and have certain important things in common with each other that's really fundamental to understand. So that's one thing to keep in mind as we move forward through some of these thoughts. Okay, so Buddha lived around 500 BC. You know the story probably. He was born into a Kshatriya family. He was the king, or he was a prince, and his father did not want him to leave the household and become a renunciant, as had been predicted. So he builds him this beautiful palace, and he's attended by beautiful women, and life is wonderful. And one day, finally, he leaves his palace, and he sees death, and he sees old age, and he sees sickness, and he's blown away by what all this world is. He decides to leave the home. He leaves the home. He studies with different masters. So these were ostensibly, you could say, Hindu masters, probably different yogic masters. And, surpassing all of the things that were required of him by those masters, he finally went off by himself, and of course attained his, not enlightenment, but I would rather say awakening. Buddha means one who's awake. So the enlightenment metaphor, it's nice, it sounds good, but it's not actually the best translation or understanding of the term Buddha. Buddha literally means he woke up, the awakened one. It's like he was asleep before. And that's the experience of this Buddhist enlightenment, Buddhist awakening, is you think reality is a certain way. You're functioning at a certain level, and then you have this kind of insight, this realization. And then you say, aha, now I get it. Now it's like being asleep to something and then waking up. That kind of So Buddha lived in, like I said, he was born in Lumbini. You can see it there, it's in Nepal. And Pataliputra, is modern day Bihar. So that was the main area where Buddha was spending time, and that's where he traveled. And after his enlightenment, he went and taught. Like I said, the first sermon was in the Deer Park, and then he had a lot of movement elsewhere. And over the centuries after Buddha, this is an amazing map because it shows the vast kind of spread of Buddhism in Asia. So you can see, basically, you have movements down into southern India, like George, you're working on this stuff right here. It's very interesting. Amaravati, that's like where I'm from. But very important southern spread was to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was a key place where early Buddhism really flourished, and that's where the Tripitaka, or the three baskets, or the main Buddhist canon, was written down in Pali, in Sri Lanka, actually. Another passage went up through the northwest side, and you get all into Afghanistan, into the Silk Road. It goes into China, it goes into Tibet, into Southeast Asia, so finally, of course, into Korea, and then in Japan. So Buddhism spread for hundreds of years through all of this terrain, and a lot of it was driven by the fact that Buddhism was an option in terms of religious identity for this new kind of up-and-coming, mobilizing merchant communities. So Buddhism and trade is a very interesting concept to think about. But I'll quickly move through all this. I just want to show that, for centuries, Buddhism was spreading. Okay, so this is Nalanda, what's left of Nalanda. This is a Buddhist university. And I call it a transdisciplinary multiversity because it really was a place where you didn't come to just study Buddhism. To understand Buddhism, you have to study Jainism, you have to study Vedanta, you have to study this, you have to study all of these other things. And you would learn grammar, and you would learn literature. So it's a very amazing kind of place, and there's beautiful stories about people coming to visit, so I give you one quote. Oops, that went way too far. Okay. There are present kings of 18 countries, 3,000 priests thoroughly acquainted with the great and little vehicle, besides about 3,000 Brahmins and their granthas. Their granthas are Jains. And their grantha literally means one who does not have the knot. So they didn't have the knot that they would tie the robes with, because their granthas, the Jains would go naked. So their granthas. So Brahmins and Jains and about 1,000 priests of the Nalanda monastery. All these noted persons alike celebrated for their literary skill, as for their dialectic, attended the assembly with a view to consider and listen to the sounds of the Dhamma. So it's a very vibrant place. And like, here this is in 602, Chinese pilgrim, Buddhist pilgrim is coming to see what this Nalanda is all about. This is a period, this is pretty late in India, so this is like, over 1,000 years after Buddha. But in India, Buddhism is still flourishing, but it's kind of become more academic at this point. Practicing Buddhists kind of got absorbed into practicing, you could say, Hindus for a large extent. And Buddhism really existed in India at this later point as, a place where intellectuals would go and develop texts and develop arguments and et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't so much, you would say, like a religion of the people at this point. Again, there's a lot of stuff I'm kind of glossing over, but just to give some perspectives. So, one of the themes of this talk, of course, is trees and roots and what all that means. And trees are very important to Buddhism. This is the tree that the Buddha attained his awakening underneath this tree. And interestingly enough, technically this is the tree, but technically it's not. So the original Bodhi tree was dying, and Ashoka's wife actually took a cutting from that tree and planted it in Sri Lanka. And then when this tree died, the one in India, they brought a sampling from the Sri Lankan tree and they planted it here. So technically this is kind of that same Bodhi tree is still there, and it's venerated by everybody. So if you go to, this is in Bodh Gaya, that's the place where Buddha had his enlightenment, it's in Bihar. If you go to Bodh Gaya today, you will see monks from every part of the world. So there's a Taiwanese monastery, Chinese monastery, Tibetan monastery, Thai monastery. I mean, everybody has a monastery in Bodh Gaya. So that's like the one place I feel like people really see the kind of international kind of quality of Buddhism, because everybody looks back to this as the start of it all. So Buddhists around the world, I think they have a clear sense that Buddha was Indian. I mean, that is very much in the consciousness, I think, of a practicing, at least a monk, let's say. So the other reason I wanted to mention this tree was I wanted to introduce a word that kind of comes up in a lot of discussions. It's called deracination. Deracination. So to deracinate something, racin is a root. So it basically means to uproot something. It's like a fancy academic word for uprooting. So deracinization and replanting. The example that I just gave of the Bodhi tree is a good example of that. I mean, it is the same tree, but it's not the same tree. And what we're going to see next is how Buddhism itself has been uprooted from this kind of a context as it's spread. And before we just do that, I just wanted to show one other tree. The Aswatha tree, this comes up in the Upanishads. These are old Sanskrit philosophical texts, which you could say are part of Hinduism. But the Upanishads, the real philosophical side of Hindu thought, the Upanishads and Buddhism and Jainism are so similar. I mean, these three things really gel together. So one famous tree there is a Asutta tree, which stands upside down, and it's supposed to represent kind of the eternalness of life. Trees, you know, are connected to things, are interconnected to each other. And so I think it's a good metaphor for how all of these different philosophical, religious, you know, traditions are all related to each other. Okay. So, what happens when we take a religion or a practice out of its context and put it in somewhere else? I mean, even like, you know, you've seen banyan trees in India. The roots grow down, and then they start growing new trunks. So this is a theme even within our own, like, you know, plant world, that we can see how this works. For example, we'll kind of come to some examples in a second, but you know, in general, you can say Buddhism has become quite popular, or rather, mindfulness, the term I'll come to, has become quite popular. It's a kind of a, you know, hot word these days. And now we're seeing mindfulness programs in India. Or let us take, for example, yoga. When I first moved to India, like 15 years ago or 10 years ago, you know, my friends would say, oh, it'll be great, you'll have a yoga studio on every corner. I was like, no, you've never been to India, there's no yoga studios in India. I don't know what you're talking about. But now they're starting to come. But really, 20 years ago, no one in India did yoga. Let's be clear about this, unless you were a yogi. And a yogi, I mean, for an Indian, a yogi is like, you know, someone who's renounced, they've gone out, that's what they do yoga. You know, it's not downward dog here. This is a lifestyle, right? You're committed to that. Now, we Indians in India are also doing these yogas and downward dogs, and you know, Modi's on his bouncy ball, and you know, we have International Yoga Day, you know, so it's all happening. So that's what I mean about cultural circulation. This is also how culture works. It starts here, it goes there, and then it comes back to this place. It changes, it moves. And I don't want to attach any like negative valence to any of this. I don't want to say that it's bad for an American to practice Buddhism or it's bad for an Indian to practice yoga. No. Anything is good if your intentions are good. And you're aware that these things do have roots. They do have like a cultural context that comes with it. I think that's really the most important thing. If you're aware of that and can appreciate that, then you can be more respectful. So I just find that the banyan tree is a great example of that kind of thing. So this is a type of re-racination. So let's keep going. So one of the things, and this I was talking to, one of the things that, going back to this whole, what is the difference between Buddhism and Hinduism? Is Buddhism an offshoot of Hinduism? I would not say it was an offshoot, but I'd say they both arose from the same incredibly rich philosophical milieu of like 500 BC. And yes, Buddhism grew, and like I said, it kind of got to be more academic later on. But one of the things that happened was later Hindu writers, you could say Hindu, felt that Buddha, or in order to kind of bring back Buddhism into the fold, they made one of the avatars of Vishnu into Buddha. So in many lists, in fact, I just read the Bhagavatam. In that, they clearly list Buddha as an avatar of Vishnu. In fact, they even make a subtle reference that Mahavira could have been a avatar of Vishnu. But what does that mean? When I read those stories, what that means to me is, in a way, probably, you know, maybe Buddhists were getting some patronage of kings, or you know, getting a lot of support, and so, you know, these followers of Vishnu or anybody, whoever else, not Buddha, needed a way to kind of say that, well, Buddha is just, part of Hinduism anyway. But what I see in that, again, is a type of acceptance of the similarities of real core principles that are being taught. Which is, again, in Buddhism, spending time with that personal reflection, which again, is also part of Hinduism. So, whether or not Buddhism and Hinduism are like different, it's hard to say. Why wasn't Mahavira as well known as an avatar of Vishnu? Well, this is interesting too. Or, one might ask, why did Buddhism die out in India, but not Jainism? This is a big question, and there's a lot of debate on this. One of them is what I was kind of mentioning before. Buddhism really developed in a kind of academic way. Monastic traditions in monasteries or in institutional settings by themselves, writing texts, whereas Jaina communities were much more connected to the itinerant wandering of monks along trade routes, along villages and cities where Jain communities would stay. And so there was some kind of community-based relationship that was strong in Jainism that didn't feature as much in Indian Buddhism. That's one possible reason. There are maybe others, and we can get into the discussion about some of those things. But the main point I'm trying to make, this actually is from a place called Rani Kebab in Gujarat, in Patna. And it's a whole set of these huge blocks, these wells, step wells that you walk down. So here there's a set of panels of all the avatars of Vishnu. Here clearly this is Buddha. So the difference between Buddhism and Hinduism, it's questionable. If you feel, like I said, when I grew up, I basically grew up thinking that Buddha was just like another guy, another person to practice or follow or listen to and hear the stories of. So I don't know, these things can get a little complicated, and let's see what happens next. Right, sort of mentioned Ambedkar. So Buddhism technically, we say, died out in India, like in the medieval period. And there really weren't any like indigenous Buddhists in India, maybe in some places. But the real shift happened when Ambedkar converted to Buddhism at the end of his life. And the reason for his conversion is pretty fascinating. I mean, of course, he had a lot of issues with caste system, which he equated with Hindu religion. And, there are some issues that we could discuss about that. And maybe then he should have sought no religion at all. But he sought Buddhism. And this is a fascinating thing. And here I'll give you a quote. The direct answer to the question as to why I am inclined towards Buddhism is that no religion can be compared to it. If a modern man who knows science must have a religion, the only religion he can have is a religion of the Buddha. Now, this is actually quite a fascinating thing because essentially, Ambedkar is saying that Buddhism isn't really like a religion, it's more scientific, right? And this point, Buddhism is not a religion, Buddhism is a science. This is a major thing of a major factor of how Buddhism is spread in America, particularly, and recently. Not kind of the 60s, 70s hippie spread, but the more recent, like 90s, 2000s spread of Buddhism is very much because of this distinction of Buddhism being scientific. There's no God in Buddhism. There's no God in Judaism either. But if you actually read Buddhism and see what Buddhism, plenty of gods flying around in Buddhism, and plenty of rituals that people do, and plenty of everything. So to just say Buddhism is a philosophy or just a science, I think, again, is also only taking a part of what Buddhism is. So let's keep going. So Buddhism, is it a science or a religion? The amazing amount of research being done now on Buddhist monks, meditation, contemplation, mindfulness, all of this stuff, putting diodes on the brain, finding out what happens. This is like a hot thing in neuroscience, cognitive science. And people really do believe that Buddhism is a philosophy because it doesn't have a God. It's not only a philosophy, it's a science. It's like something like that is just true and right because you've experimented on it and proven it to be true. It doesn't require belief. It's a science of the mind. I think there's a lot to be discussed in that. So the mindfulness culture, this is what I mean. This is a classic example of deracinated practice. Classic example of what we might call, and many people do, call cultural appropriation. Now, what happens when somebody takes a Buddhist meditation practice, doesn't tell you about Buddhism, and just teaches you something but calls it mindfulness? But says mindfulness is not religion, this is not Buddhism, this is nothing, this is something called mindfulness. I think there's an issue. And I'm not saying again that it's bad, or good or bad. Remember, I still do believe that culture moves in these circles. But if you're going to teach something called mindfulness, I hope you would also say that this came straight from the Buddhist canon. That this was straight up Buddhist meditational practice which we have put into, let's say, hospitals. So to come to the point, Buddhism is not a religion, Buddhism is science. So we can't have religious stuff going on in our, healthcare provider system. But if we have something scientific, which Buddhism is, then it has to be in our scientific, in our healthcare system. And now people want to make mindfulness practice, compulsory for children, let us say. Is that a good thing? I don't know. These are all the questions that I'm wondering about too. My main point is to say this. Cultures move, practices move, all of that is fine. But if we don't give credit where credit is due, it's like not giving a citation when you're writing a book. So I have no issue with people doing mindfulness, but I hope they know where mindfulness came from. I hope they understand what Buddhism was, to understand it better. That it's not just, again, when something is uprooted, right? The context gets left behind, and you just get this kind of tree or plant. The problem with that, in what I see, is it essentializes Buddhism to just the practice of meditation or mindfulness. Or yoga. It reduces yoga to just asanas. If you read Yoga Sutras, you'll find that asana is like number 6 or 7 in the Ashtanga of yoga. So when someone comes to me and says, I'm a yogi, I mean, if I say you're a yogi, that's like an amazing thing, and you've committed your life to a lifestyle. No, I just do, whatever, vinyasa flow every Saturday morning. I mean, that doesn't count for me. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, because again, this is how culture moves, but it is our job to, especially, being the homeland of these traditions, we should also promote this kind of understanding amongst people. That's essentially what I believe in trying to do. So, mindfulness, okay, if it's helping you, good. My only caveat would be, take some time to learn more about where it came from. Oh yeah, so I was doing some research, and now there's a mindfulness summit in India. So this is a perfect example of what I was talking about before. Buddhism starts, mindfulness starts, Buddha's doing his stuff. Finally, it comes to America. Now it's like this big craze. now we're back in India, nice smiling Tibetan monks, and we're having India Summit with this guy, his name, Vail. And people in India are really excited about this stuff. So, it's fine. This is how culture works, this is how culture moves. Maybe this is an opportunity for Indians in India to say, okay, people need to know more about this stuff. Let us create opportunities for people to learn about these great traditions. Now here, I used to have a picture of the Dalai Lama, but of course, you know, there's been a lot of controversy around the Dalai Lama, unfortunately, recently. So, decided to go with Thich Nhat Hanh. But all of these masters, Buddhist masters, Dalai Lama, of course, Tibetan, Thich Nhat Hanh, is that they wanted to discuss Buddhism in that way that would make it, you know, open to everybody. So Thich Nhat Hanh, his philosophy of interbeing, and we're all interconnected, of course, very old Buddhist principle. And what I really want to talk about was what the Dalai Lama was talking about for many years is secular ethics. Is the idea that you don't need a religion to have these kinds of ethics. And you can have some kind of, you know, common basis of all of humanity without any recourse to a particular religion or a particular set of beliefs. That there was something fundamentally universal about our humanity. Now, that's also very interesting and very good. But just to speak on this word secular for 1 second, because secular is a tricky word. Secular is really comes out of like American discourse on, you know, from Rhode Island, where I'm from. This is the beginning of the separation of church and state. That these two things are never connected. And you know, in India, we never had this word in the Constitution until I don't know, like in the 70s or up over the exact time probably. When we added the word secular to the Constitution.
1976, 22nd Constitution.
There you go. See, I told you to tell you. So it was not there until 1976. And we were a republic, we were socialists, we were democracy,
We weren't socialists.
We weren't socialists?
Socialists and secular until 76, 22nd Constitution amendment.
Okay, socialism. Yeah. So this idea of secularity, I think, is also something that we should think about more, because India is not a secular place. No matter what you want to say, it's not a secular place. It's a pluralistic place. So secularity in and of itself as a term creates a kind of position of, you know, religion out. Whereas pluralism says, religion in, no problem, any religion in, doesn't matter. So I think there's a subtle difference, not even a subtle, there's a great difference between those two kind of modalities. So I think thinking about the pluralism of it all, which I've tried, I hope, to explain a little bit of, is something that we can do. And maybe not just secular ethics, but, I don't know, universal is also problematic too. Because this is, when you say something is universal again, that brings you back to the science argument, right? Because science is universal, science is for everybody, science is proving here or there, doesn't matter, I do the experiment, it's all the same. So these pushes towards universalizing things or scientificizing things also have the danger of, I think, clouding diversity and the pluralism that's actually inherent in all this. Not to say that in my heart of hearts I don't believe that there are, you know, some very fundamental principles that we all humans are dealing with, like suffering, like you mentioned, and that, you know, these are good things. But I'm just throwing this out there in a sense of to frame some of the topics that we can discuss. Okay, I think we're almost done. So here's one quote from Shantideva, who's actually a great master and scholar who studied at Nalanda and so forth. And he wrote the Bodhicharya Avatara, which really talks about these bodhisattva ideal. And that is really what makes Mahayana Buddhism really different than Hinayana or the older schools. Mahayana has the bodhisattva ideal. That is to say that my goal is not just enlightenment for myself, but I want enlightenment for everybody. And until everybody gets it, nobody will really have it. So may all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. Yeah.
And so I think you alluded to this earlier, but it seems like most religions feel that they are kind of the superior religion.
Right.
So their religion is better than, let's say, others. And so they try to convert everybody else to their own religion.
Right.
Do you feel that Buddhism is the, let's say, superior religion, and like everybody in the world should convert to it? You know, and you know, what are your reasons for believing or not believing that?
Yeah, I don't believe that. Although I could see someone making that argument, as I see most people in the common mindfulness world making that argument, saying, hey, this isn't even a religion. This is just like science of the mind. It's just the truth. Like, meditation is good for you. You should do it. It's like exercise. Now, my mom's never meditated a day in her life, but I feel like she's way more mentally advanced than some meditators that I know. You know what I mean? So I think Buddhism, well, look, when Buddhism started, after that first lecture that the Buddha gave, then he told his disciples that go out and preach this to the masses. So Buddha did proselytize, whereas, I mean, Hinduism is not a proselytizing religion. So, I mean, if I had to make an argument about the ultimate religion, I mean, maybe I'd say it was Hinduism, because you don't have to do anything, you don't have to believe anything, you don't have to do anything, actually. So, and no one's telling you to join it or not join it. So, I don't think Buddhism is as a religion, superior. What I do love about Buddhism is like that penultimate quote, is that last quote. Because, you know, the heart of Buddhism... It's not faith. Huh? It's not faith. It's not faith. It's self-inquiry that gives birth to your own personal faith. Because there is faith in Buddhism. Shraddha is an important part in Buddhism. I mean, and this is, again, now when I have to come back to this all the time. Like, if you want to think that Buddhism is just some religion with no God and it's all science, boss, you've never read a Buddhist text in your life. Because if you read the Buddhist text, all you'll find is, we love and bow down to the Buddha, who's the greatest thing in the whole universe, and, oh, you know, we have faith in the Buddha, and all this kind of stuff. So all of those terms and ideas of a religion are kind of there in Buddhism. But again, at its core, it's about this inner reflection. At the same time, I could make that same analysis for Hinduism. I could say the core of Hinduism is in the Upanishads. And it's all about self-inquiry. That's why there is something very much at the core of Hinduism that's exactly like the core of Buddhism.
The mindfulness can also be deemed to be coming from yoga.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So mindfulness could be an offshoot of yoga, and you could say
100%
that is kind of a conduit from Hinduism.
100% it is. 100%. I mean, look, if today you talk to people and you say, I do meditation, they think you're a Buddhist. There are many, many traditions in this world that have meditation. Hinduism, of course, being one of them. Christianity has a huge tradition of meditation. Sufism has. So Buddhism is not the sole religious, purveyor of meditation. And if you really want to get into the history of stuff, I mean, what's really happening with Hinduism, and now I'm really going to break it down, and this is simple, but it's the truth, is you have the Vedic Brahmanical side of Hinduism, and then you have the yogic side of Hinduism. And it's the meeting of these two that really brings us to the Upanishads and then leads to everything else. And that yogic stuff is really old. And remember when I said Buddha left home and he went to go study with these masters? It's with those yogic masters who are ostensibly, you could say, Hindus. But they're yogic masters, and he studied all those yogas, and then he got to this meditation and mindfulness. You know, mindfulness in Pali, in Buddhism, in Sanskrit, mindfulness comes from the Sanskrit word smriti. And all mindfulness means is remembering. My guru used to always tell me, he said, it's like, you know, you're in a discussion and something happens, and then you get really angry and you kind of blow up and you yell and you get upset and do all these things. That's when you have to be mindful, because you have to remember who you really are. That's not you, that's not the real you that's getting angry. You just kind of like, you know, not being yourself right then. It's always constant memory of like my true self. Who am I really? So mindfulness is nothing but like getting back to the true self. So yes, I definitely think those principles are 100% there in India well before Buddha. Definitely. 200%.
Hi. Regarding the map that you showed very early on in your presentation regarding
Yeah.
the spread of
Oh yeah,
Buddhism.
here we go. Yeah.
I wanted to know if there's any history of it spreading a bit further west to, for example, Persia, where they had a strong Zoroastrian tradition, and then further west where you had pre-Islamic, Middle Eastern, and Levantine traditions. Is there any history of it spreading that far? And if not, why do you think that was the case? Could there have been some sort of like cultural incompatibility at that point? After which you'd say, there was also, for example, later on when you had Islam, there was also a cultural incompatibility with that compared to the traditions that they practiced locally in Arabia and in the Levantine area compared to their own pre-Islamic faiths and beliefs.
Yeah. Those are good questions. I don't know of any evidence of Buddhism going into Iran or further west, but definitely went into Afghanistan. And you know, that's a particularly very interesting area, Gandhara. That's what we call modern Kandahar. And in that region, there were a bunch of Greeks. So when you look at the artwork and the history of Buddhism in this northwest area, you'll find Buddhas with, you know, Greek robes, Buddhas with, you know, European facial features. So there was cross-cultural dynamism happening with Buddhism. And like I was saying to the other question, you know, when it goes to Tibet, it mixes with Bon. When it goes to China, it mixes with Taoism. When it goes to Japan, it mixes with Shintoism, like that. So it takes on qualities of all of these areas. But I don't have any evidence of it spreading further west. And the reason, I'm not sure. Certainly, this major spread that you're seeing, like in China, that's all trade routes. So I don't know, maybe there were trade relationships that were not as solidified as the ones that were happening on this side. Because like I said, Buddhism and trade was really how it spread to all of these places. So we'll have to do more historical research into that. It's a good question. But no, I don't know about Middle East or further afield. Of course, then Buddhism comes to America, like, you know, fairly strongly in the 60s. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah, he had a. So.
Yeah, just quickly, that you mentioned the trade in Buddhism. That was a big proponent of Islam as well, how it spread to Southeast Asia and even further east. That was through trade. Why do you think it was one way, not the other, later on, perhaps?
Well, by the time, well, like I was saying, one of the things that people say why Buddhism died is because Islam spreading into India and not being happy with this or that, or destroying monasteries. I don't know. It's a good question. You're saying if the religion were spreading this way, why wasn't there? So because at least from a Buddhist perspective, I would say that Buddhism didn't have that stronghold anymore by the, you know, let's say like 8th century, 9th century. And like I said, basically became more of an academic exercise, a pursuit of intellectuals, you could say, in India, and not like the common practice thing. But then you could argue, well, why didn't the practiced religion that they were having in India go that way? I don't know. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, the Zoroastrian religion in Iran,
Zoroastrianism, yeah.
was the same time as Buddhism, approximately.
Yeah.
So that might be the reason why it did not go to Iran, Buddhism.
That's true, because Zoroastrianism was already well known, and
It's a monotheistic religion.
yeah,
Monotheistic.
yeah. But these movements, it takes a few hundred years before a lot of this stuff starts happening. Last question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So, as you mentioned that in India, it ended up becoming a more academic discipline.
I would say, yeah.
As it went to other countries and it clearly is very prevalent in the modern world, did it morph into something that became more accessible? Like, did the monks practice it in a different manner, which made it more accessible to the public? Or did it remain a more academic religion and the culture made it easier for the people to access it elsewhere?
I think the latter. I think actually, like I'm arguing, part of this like intellectualization of Buddhism was what made it so wonderful to spread to other places, because look, this is exactly what I mean about the uprooting part. Like, if I'm saying that it's just like this intellectual exercise, right? You don't have to do any pujas, you don't have to believe anything. It's just like a information, right? Then that becomes easily transportable and easily, picked up by people, because you don't need to do any other things. You don't need to, have some conversion. You don't need to have any. So that's why, like right now, people are everywhere, especially in this country, are practicing straight up Buddhist meditation, and they have no idea where it came from or what it is. And yet, at the same time, they're, how many people I meet these days say, I'm a Buddhist. I'm like, really? Okay. Whatever that means. So I think it was because of the intellectual nature of it that it was easy to spread in that sense. And it didn't require any other kind of commitments, spiritually or mentally or physically. It was just simply, here's the information. So like right now, you can go to an MBSR class and you can learn straight up what they call like mindfulness meditation from the Buddhist canon, and you will never hear the word Buddhism or Buddha mentioned at all, because we don't deal with religion. This is a science. Oh yeah, Buddhist, the proper Buddhists who are actually Buddhists, born and brought up kind of Buddhists, everybody knows. And that's why I was saying, when you go to Bodh Gaya, everybody goes to Bodh Gaya, because everyone wants a piece of India. And every tradition of Buddhism that has spread outside of India, they love India because they know it's the home of the Buddha, and every lineage wants its line to somehow make its way back to Buddha, back to India. So going back to India is really like a very important thing. Exactly. Okay, thank you all very, very much. I really had a nice time.
Thank you so much, Professor. We all found your talk enlightening and definitely one to remember. Thank you. I'd now like to invite Mr. Atul Singh to the stage. Mr. Singh is the founder and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer, a global citizen media platform. Oh, and he's also my boss. Please welcome Mr. Atul Singh.
All right, can you hear me at the back? Excellent, jolly good. So I run Fair Observer. This is FO Talks. We've been conducting them for a while, and the whole idea of conducting these talks is to get you insights from eminent chaps like Srinivas Reddy, Professor Srinivas Reddy, I often forget because he's such a dear friend, address the honorific. And you go away with something to think about. You learn something. And you meet people from different backgrounds, different cultures, different disciplines, and hopefully expand your mind. What is Fair Observer? Well, in a simple nutshell, we look at the deeper issues behind the news. We provide context, because as Srini said, context is key. And we provide you many perspectives from around the world. And we have more than 2,500 voices. And in that sense, we are very similar to what Srini mentioned. We are a pluralistic organization. Samuel Olunga there, who's my co-author from Kenya, has a different point of view to me. We are very similar, we are very dear friends, but we are defined to some degree, not entirely, because we have free will, by our backgrounds, by our disciplines, by our personalities. And if you look at the various authors, and we have Alex Gloy in the back, who's German, who's an economist, who'll be publishing tomorrow about US debt and who's going to buy it. He's coming from his particular vantage point in education, in erudition, in culture. After all, he's not German, he's a good Protestant. He's Lutheran culturally. So we're all products of, not prisoners, products of our own universes. And most people who know me know that I come from a place near Sarnath. My ancestral village is a stone's throw away from Sarnath, which is where Buddhism began. So I come from the land of the Buddha. I come from a Kshatriya background like the Buddha. I left home and wandered around like the Buddha. I never acquired wisdom unlike the Buddha. And in some ways, what we try to do is embody some of the deepest civilizational principles from all lands, and in particular ours. And that in particular is to be awake. We inform and educate people, so we see that as part of the Buddha tradition. Buddha, the root is buddhi, which translates as the brain, literally, but it's much more than the brain. It can mean judgment, it can mean intelligence, it can mean intuition, it can mean the marrying of reason and intuition, and so on and so forth. And what we are trying to do is to bring together, in a world of attention deficit disorder, in a society which is time truncated, a little bit of thinking, a little bit of observing, and a little bit of transcending the echo chambers and the filter bubbles that define our world today. Only a fool stands between a hungry audience and dinner. Ipso facto, I will cease to speak. But thank you very much for coming. It is a joy to see so many people from Ghana and Kenya, from Taiwan, from Southeast Asia, from, of course, India, from Japan. Thank you, Momo-san. Thank you, Masa. And thank you, Professor Srinivas Reddy, for an inspiring, enlightening, and most wonderful lecture. Thank you very much, everyone.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.